I still count people when I walk into a room. Not on purpose. It's not something I decide to do. It's just, I walk through a door, and some part of my brain that I can't shut off starts tallying. 1 by the window, 2 at the table, 3 near the exit. I do it in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in the break rooms of buildings I've never worked in. I did it at my nephew's birthday party last spring. Counted 9 children 3 times before I let myself pour a cup of coffee. My sister asked me what was wrong. I told her nothing. She didn't believe me, but she let it go, the way people let things go with someone who has that particular kind of quiet around them. I used to think I could unlearn it. I spent 2 sessions a week with a counselor in Bend for a year and a half after what happened on the Prager Ridge search. She was patient. She had a very clean office and a white noise machine outside her door, and she never once told me to simply stop. She understood that counting wasn't the problem. The problem was that one night I counted wrong, and a man named Gerald Fitch walked 200 yards through a Montana whiteout toward a warming hut that I'd already removed him from on my tally. And then he stopped walking. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, the wind had covered everything. 200 yards. I've walked that distance 100 times since, on trails, on parking lots, across empty fields in the middle of the night, just to feel how short it is. Short enough that he might have heard us if we'd called again. Short enough that a working flashlight pointed in the right direction might have caught the shape of him against the white. Short enough that one correct number 4, instead of 3, would have meant someone went looking. I counted 3. There were 4. Gerald Fitch was the 4 I left behind. So when I tell you this story, I want you to understand something about me before I tell you about Telek Fork, before I tell you about the logbook and the rules and the thing that added itself to our count, like a rounding error with a face. I want you to understand that I am not a careless man. I am not someone who dismisses numbers or skips steps or takes the easy route through a protocol. I am, if anything, a man made too careful, but at one time I wasn't careful enough, a man who checks and rechecks and triple counts and still cannot fully trust the number his own eyes give him. I tell you this because the job at Telek Fork was supposed to fix that. It was supposed to be the place where counting was simple, where the math was small and the consequences were manageable, where I could spend 6 months being right about numbers and slowly learn to believe myself again. Instead, it became the place where I understood why the numbers were never mine to trust in the first place. By the end of this, you'll understand why I can't sleep in a room I haven't counted from the doorway. You'll understand why I check the chair in the corner before I sit down. Why I ask people to say their own names when I meet them now. Why I keep a logbook on my nightstand with a single number written fresh each morning. I'll tell it plainly. No theater, no flourish. Just what happened, in the order it happened, and what the rules told us to do, and what we did, and what it cost. Start at the beginning, my counselor always said. The beginning is a job listing I should never have answered. I found the Telek Fork listing on a federal caretaker board in the 3rd week of October. 11 months after I'd been moved from field operations to dispatch at the regional SAR office in Missoula. That reassignment was technically voluntary. I want to be clear about that. Nobody forced me out of the field. My supervisor, a careful woman named Arlene Schiff, sat across from me after the Prager Ridge incident review and said there was a dispatch opening and it would be mine if I wanted it. And she said it in a tone that made clear wanting it was the correct answer. I wanted it. Dispatch is a job where you manage counts from a distance. You receive them, you confirm them, you log them. You never hold the flashlight. I thought that was what I needed, the numbers, without the exposure, the accountability, without the proximity to the thing that goes wrong. For 11 months, I sat in front of a radio console and confirmed headcounts for other rangers, and I was good at it. And I hated every single shift with a specific, grinding, low-temperature hatred that I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding like I was complaining about being kept safe. The Telek Fork listing described a winter caretaker post at a 2-building ranger station in interior Alaska, road closed October through April, maintained by a skeleton crew of 3 to 4 personnel. Duties included generator fuel monitoring, daily weather logging, equipment inventory, snowpack assessments, radio check-ins with a regional dispatcher, and the phrase that stopped me nightly, headcount documentation per station protocol. Counting was the whole job. I read that line 4 times. There was something in it that felt almost like mercy. No rescues, no field operations, no moment where someone's life balances on the number I write down. Just a small, fixed crew in a fixed building in a fixed location, and a log, and a number that should never change. 4 people. Log 4. Sleep. Wake up. Log 4 again. 6 months of correct arithmetic, and then spring. And maybe by spring, I'd have recalibrated something in myself that had been running wrong since that Montana night. The pay was federal caretaker scale, which is not generous. The isolation stipend bumped it to livable. The listing had been reposted 3 times since August, which I noticed but did not think carefully about. I told myself the reposting meant it was hard to fill because of the remoteness, the cold, the 6-month window. I told myself no one wanted to spend a winter in interior Alaska, counting 4 people every night. I signed the placement form on a Tuesday evening without reading the attached protocol binder, which was listed in the file as a supplementary document. I remember thinking I'd read it when I arrived. I remember thinking, how complicated could the protocol for 4 people possibly be? I've had 11 months now to think about that question. The answer is complicated enough that someone wrote a warning in the margin by hand. The bush plane was a Cessna 185 with rust along the tail seam, and a pilot who introduced herself only as Kath. She had the particular economy of movement you develop in people who spend their lives in small cockpits, no gesture wasted, no word spent on anything decorative. She loaded my gear in 4 minutes flat, filed her return window while I was still buckling in. And we were off the Fairbanks Strip and into the gray before I'd finished adjusting my headset. Interior Alaska in late October looks like someone drained the color out of the world and then froze what was left. The spruce forests below us were black-green and heavy with early snow, and the rivers showed through in flat, gray ribbons, the overflow ice already crusting at the bends. The sky was that specific shade of pewter that Alaskans call overcast and everyone else would call nightfall. We had maybe 3 hours of usable daylight left when we dropped toward the Tellick Fork airstrip, which was a gravel bar cleared of brush and marked at each end with orange traffic cones half buried in snow. Kath set the plane down hard and clean, taxied to the near end, and stopped with the engine still running. She handed me the fuel log, a laminated sheet in a plastic sleeve, before I had my seatbelt off. Written at the top in permanent marker, "Leave with the station lead." "Count everybody every night," she said. She was looking out the windscreen, not at me. "Believe the paper." I asked her what she meant. She pointed at the lodge. 60 yards of packed snow, a single path of boot tracks, the main building with its yellow window light bleeding out into the gray. She didn't say anything else. I climbed out with my bags, and before I had turned around, the Cessna was already moving. By the time I'd taken 20 steps toward the lodge, the engine sound had thinned to a hum, and then to nothing. And then the quiet came down like something physical. I have worked in remote postings before. I have overnighted in fire lookouts and backcountry cabins, and once in a tent during a 3-day ground search in a Wyoming canyon. I know what outdoor silence sounds like. It sounds like wind and birds and the occasional crack of a tree contracting in cold. It has texture. You can feel it moving. The silence at Tellick Fork didn't move. It sat on everything: the snow, the spruce line, the corrugated metal roof of the equipment shed 20 yards south of the lodge, with a weight that felt less like absence and more like attention. I stood in it for a moment, with my 2 bags and the laminated fuel log, and Kath's instruction still sitting flat in my mind. Count everybody every night. Not just do the checks or follow the protocol. Everybody. Every night. I told myself she was being colorful. Wilderness pilots develop their own flavors of dark humor. It's a professional adaptation. I told myself that right up until I pushed open the lodge door and heard the warmth inside and understood, immediately and without knowing why, that the silence outside was going to be with me for the next 6 months. The road back to the highway was already closed. There would be no other flights until April. I was here. The inside of the lodge smelled like propane, pine resin, and something frying in oil, a smell so specifically warm and human after that flat exterior silence that I stopped in the doorway for a second just to take it in. A cast iron pan on the gas range, 2 wool socks on the drying rack near the main stove, someone's radio manual face down on the common table, the small, particular clutter of people who have learned to live carefully in a tight space. 3 faces turned toward me. Halvard Nuss was the lead, a man somewhere in his late 50s, with the wide-set posture of someone who had spent decades in physical work and let it gradually become his resting shape. Norwegian ancestry, 3rd-generation Alaskan, and a face that communicated information in very small increments, a fraction of a nod, a slight narrowing behind the eyes. He looked at me the way you look at an unknown piece of equipment, assessing load capacity before putting any weight on it. June Takeda, the mechanic, sat at the table with a generator maintenance diagram spread in front of her. Early 40s, short and precise, her movements carrying an efficiency that made Halvard's look almost casual by comparison. She glanced up, nodded once, and went back to her diagram. Later, I would understand that her quietness wasn't coldness. It was the particular focus of someone who understood that the machinery, keeping 4 people alive in lethal cold, required her full attention at all times. The third one was standing on a chair to reach a high cabinet. And he jumped down when I came in and nearly knocked over the pan rack. "You're Dale," he said. He said it like he'd been waiting to. He was young mid-20s, born in Anchorage, seasonal hire, and he went by Tarm, which was short for Ptarmigan because his mother, he explained later, with the absolute sincerity of someone who was given this explanation many times, had been going through a very specific phase when he was born. Tarm was the kind of person who made spaces feel occupied. He filled the room differently than the other 2, louder in his breathing, faster in his movements, always seeming to be approximately 10% more present than the space required. Halvard didn't say welcome. He held out his hand, I shook it, and then he said, "Sign the log. Tonight's count is 4. There was a hardcover logbook open on the counter by the radio. Ruled pages, dated, with a column for names, a column for the number, and a column for notes. He pointed at tonight's entry. 3 names already written. A blank line for mine. I wrote Dale Verchick. I wrote 4. "Say it," Halvard said. I looked at him. 4? Out loud, with us here. That's how it works. 4, I said again. 4 people. He watched me for a moment. Then he nodded and relaxed a fraction, the kind of relaxation that was more a reduction in tension than an actual settling. He took the pen back and capped it. I asked him if this was a standard procedure. He put the logbook in its place on the shelf, squared it to the edge, and turned back to the room. "You didn't read the binder?" "I was going to read it when After dinner," he said, "and then we'll talk about it." Tarm set a plate in front of me. June looked up from her diagram long enough to say, 4 goes in fast, before you think about it too much. And then she looked back down at the generator schematic. I didn't know what that meant yet. The stove ticked in the corner. Outside, the dark was already total. After dinner, Halvard set the protocol binder on the table in front of me. It was a black 3-ring binder, standard federal issue. But the cover page inside was not a standard federal document. It was a laminated single sheet, typed in a plain serif font, titled Telic Fork Winter Operations Station Protocol. And at the top right corner, someone had written a date in pen that was 11 years ago. And underneath that date, 3 successive dates after it, each in different handwriting, as if the document had been readopted by each incoming crew in turn. 6 rules. I read them the first time quickly, the way you read a document you're not convinced you need. Then I went back to Rule 1 and read it again, slowly. At every check-in, count aloud, by name, every person inside the lodge. Write the number. The written number is the truth. If your eyes disagree with the logbook is correct. I sat with that for a moment. I'm a former field ranger and a trained SAR dispatcher. My professional entire life has been built on the principle that direct observation supersedes documentation that what you see in the field corrects the map, not the other way around. And here was Rule 1 telling me, in plain language, that if I looked at the room and counted 5, but the logbook said 4, I was to accept 4 as the truth and discard what my eyes told me. I said, "This is backwards." Halvard, leaning against the counter with his coffee, said, "Keep reading." Rule 2. Nobody enters or exits the lodge between the 9 p.m. count and the 6 a.m. count. If someone is outside at 9 p.m., they overnight in the shed. No exceptions, even for the injured. I closed the binder. The shed isn't heated to survival temperature, I said. If someone's caught outside at 9 with a broken leg, you're telling me they sleep in a 12-degree equipment shed. The shed has a sleeping bag rated to -30, a propane burner, a radio, and a week of food, Halvard said. It's not the lodge, but it's survivable. And if they're badly injured? Then you talk them through the night on the radio. And you don't open the door. You don't open the door. I looked at June. She was looking at her coffee mug. Tarm was looking at the window. I had the distinct impression this was a conversation they had already had with other people at other times, and that they had both made their separate peace with the answer. Who made these rules? I asked. Somebody who learned the hard way, Halvard said. Same as everything up here. I opened the binder again and looked at Rule 1. The written number is the truth. I thought about Gerald Fitch. I thought about the number 3 I wrote down in a whiteout on Prager Ridge while Gerald Fitch walked 200 yards and then stopped. I thought about how, in that moment, the number I wrote was wrong and the field was right. The field contained a 4th person I hadn't counted. And the gap between what I logged and what was true was the gap a man walked into and never came back from. Rule 1 was asking me to do the exact opposite. It was asking me to let the logbook overrule my eyes. I understood, in some remote and not yet functional part of my brain, that there was a reason for this. That these rules were not written carelessly. That whoever typed that original laminated sheet did it the way you write something after you've already paid for the knowledge. I just didn't understand the geometry of it yet. I turned the page. Rule 3 took up more space on the page than the others. It was the only rule with subclauses. If the nightly count is one too many, do not search for the extra. Cut all interior lights, name each real person into the dark, and wait for the generator's 3 a.m. cycle. When the lights return, count again. This resets the number. Never do Rule 3 twice in one night. I read it twice, and I looked up at Halvard. This is a superstition, I said. It came out more carefully than I intended. The way you say something when you're not entirely sure you believe it. Halvard didn't react to the word. He just waited in the way he had of waiting not passively, not impatiently, but with the specific quality of someone who has a response ready and has decided to let you finish first. Counting wrong is a math problem, I continued. You don't solve math problems by turning the lights off and saying names in the dark. You recount, you verify, you. The last caretaker said that, Halvard said. Something in his tone stopped me. What happened to the last caretaker? Halvard looked at me steadily. There's an opening, he said. That was all. There's an opening. Not he left, not he transferred, not the post became available in the natural rotation. There's an opening, as if the position and the person had been separated in some way that required no elaboration to anyone currently standing in this room. Tarm had gone very still by the window. I looked back at the binder. "The never twice clause," I said. "Why not twice?" "Because once is a correction," June said, from the table. She hadn't looked up. "Twice is something else." I waited for her to explain what something else meant. She didn't. She turned a page on her diagram and ran one finger along a circuit schematic with the careful attention of someone who has decided this conversation is finished. I understood I was not going to get more than that tonight. There was a grammar to this crew, a set of rhythms and silences that had developed over the weeks before my arrival. And one of those silences was the one that came after someone asked too directly about the mechanism behind the rules. You could live inside the rules. You could follow them, extend them, implement them. You were not, apparently, encouraged to excavate them. I wrote the subclauses down on the inside cover of my personal notebook. Never twice. The generator's cycle. The names into the dark. I told myself I was documenting for professional reference. I was actually doing it because the phrase had settled somewhere at the base of my chest, and I needed it out of my head and onto paper, where I could look at it from a distance and convince myself it was just procedure. The generator coughed in the utility room. It was 2:58 a.m. exactly, and the lights dipped for 1 second, then held. Tarm caught my expression. "Does that every night at 3, he said. "You get used to it." I did not, in the end, get used to it. Rules 4 and 5 were on the next page, and they read differently from the first 3, less like safety procedures, and more like behavioral specifications, the kind of language you find in institutional guidelines when the authors want to be precise without being explicit about why. Rule 4. The radio dispatcher will confirm your All Souls number back to you every morning. If dispatch's number does not match yours, trust dispatch. If dispatch does not answer, assume the count is already wrong. Rule 5. Do not let anyone recite the count for you. Each person may state only their own name at the 9 p.m. check. Anyone who volunteers another person's name is not counted as present. The logic of Rule 4 was uncomfortable in the way that rules are uncomfortable when they point at the inadequacy of someone specific. In my case, the rule was telling me the man who had once written a wrong number in a field log that if my count and the dispatcher's count disagreed, my count was the error. Trust dispatch. Not trust yourself, not trust the room, not trust the physical evidence of the people standing in front of you. Trust the number a voice on a radio says. I asked Halvard why the morning radio confirmation took precedence over our own physical count. Because you could be wrong about who's standing in front of you, he said. Dispatch is outside. Dispatch doesn't have the same problem. I didn't ask him to elaborate on the same problem yet. I was still processing Rule 5. The rule about names was, on its surface, a procedural oddity. In the nightly check, each person states their own name. Only their own. If someone says a teammate's name, if someone volunteers another person's identity into the count, they are not considered present. they are not counted. As if the act of speaking for someone else, of inserting another person's name from the outside, is itself a disqualification. I thought about how strange that was. In every formal headcount I'd ever run, the fastest and most efficient approach was the one where the counter calls the names and the people respond. Standard, verified. Why would you penalize someone for helping? Rule 6 answered that question in the worst possible way. Rule 6. If you ever count yourself twice, if you hear your own name answered when you did not speak, end the count immediately. Do Rule 3, and do not sleep until dawn. I read it 3 times. I was aware that the room had gotten quieter around me, though nobody had moved. Even Tarm, who generated ambient noise the way some people generate heat, had gone to some private internal place and closed the door. If you hear your own name answered when you did not speak. I turned the page to see if there was anything after the 6th rule. There wasn't. Just the original typed text and the laminate, and in the lower right corner of the laminated sheet, in the white margin outside the text area, written in blue pen, in a cramped and slightly tilted hand. The count is a door, don't hold it open. The handwriting was nothing like the typed text. It was nothing like the formal signatures on the adoption dates. It was pressed hard into the paper, the kind of pressure you apply when you are writing something quickly or urgently or with hands that are not entirely steady. I looked up. Who wrote this? Halvard looked at the page. Don't know? One of the previous crews. Probably? Which one? He took the binder, gently, closed it, and put it on the shelf beside the logbook. You should get some rest, he said. First full check is 9 p.m. tomorrow. June had already folded her diagram. Tarm was looking at the floor. I lay in my bunk that night, with the words sitting in the ceiling above me. The count is a door. I thought about the margin note, and the handwriting, and the date it wasn't written on. I thought about the 6 rules, and the logic underneath them, the logic that said seeing was unreliable, that helpfulness was a red flag, that hearing your own name could be a signal of something catastrophic. At 3 a.m., the generator coughed. The lights dipped. I counted the darkness in the bunk room. 1, 2, 3, 4. All present, all accounted for. I believed the number completely, and I hated that I couldn't be certain why. The first 10 days at Telek Fork had the structured, slightly numbing quality of any new technical job in a confined environment, a series of procedures to learn, rhythms to absorb, the steady replacement of unfamiliarity with routine. I'm good at routine. It's one of the things the Prager Ridge incident didn't take from me. If anything, it sharpened it. Routine is the antidote to the kind of improvised decision-making that gets people killed. And I had spent the better part of 2 years building a life as tightly structured as I could make it. Mornings at Telek Fork started at 6 with the All Souls radio check-in to regional dispatch. I'd key the HF set, give my station ID and the count. Telek Fork, 4 souls, all present. And the dispatcher on the other end would read it back and log it. Clean, simple, closed loop. Then fuel gauge check on the main generator. Snow load inspection of both roof lines. A walk of the buddy rope line to confirm no ice damage. Halvard ran the weather packet downloads from the satellite receiver. June handled the generator maintenance schedule with a thoroughness that bordered on ritual. She knew that machine the way some people know music, by feel and sound, and the particular quality of a hesitation that shouldn't be there. Tarm and I drew the outdoor checks in rotation. You never went outside alone. That wasn't a written rule. It wasn't in the binder, but it was understood the way some things are understood between people living in a space where outside means temperatures that will kill you in under 40 minutes with no warning. You went in twos. You told the other two where you were going, and you were back before the time you said you'd be back. The 9 p.m. count became, within the first week, as automatic as brushing your teeth. We gathered in the main room. Halvard ran it. Each of us said our names. He wrote the number. We moved on. 4, 4, 4. The number was always correct, and it was always written, and Halvard's pen made the same neat 4 in the same column of the same logbook, and I began to understand why June had said to write it fast. There was a pace to it, a practiced velocity that kept the procedure from becoming something you stared at too long. You counted, you wrote, you released the count. I began to relax. Not entirely, and not without noticing that I was relaxing, which is a particular kind of awareness that a counselor would call progress, and I experienced as mild suspicion. But the days had a cleanness to them. The math was correct every night. The radio checks were crisp and uneventful. The cold outside was serious, but manageable. The kind of serious that reminds you of its nature without demonstrating it catastrophically. Tarm, on our 5th day of outdoor rounds, showed me the generator's behavior up close. The 3 a.m. cycle had apparently been misbehaving since October, something in the auto-start relay that June kept trimming back toward spec, and he walked me through what the healthy cough sounded like versus the troubled one. You'll hear it in your sleep eventually, he said, in the tone of a junior employee passing along the induction knowledge that nobody formally documents. 2-beat cough, then it catches. That's good. 3 beats and a pause is June's problem. I listened to it that night from my bunk. 2-beat cough, caught. Lights dipped and held. I slept better than I had in over a year. This is the part I want to be precise about, because it matters for what came later. I was genuinely comfortable. The station was working. The crew was functional. The rules, which had seemed so strange on first reading, had folded themselves into the routine with a completeness that made them feel less like warnings and more like good practice. Write the count. Name yourself. Don't open the door at night. It all felt proportionate to the environment. Extreme, yes, but so was everything about interior Alaska in winter. I told myself the protocol was just the rigorous edge of standard remote operations thinking, taken a few steps further than necessary by whoever first designed it. That was the comfort of the first 10 days. On the 11th night, the count took too long. I can describe the moment precisely because I went back to my personal notes afterward, and I'd written it down. The way you write down something that unnerves you before you have the language to explain why it unnerved you. The 9 p.m. count on day 11. Main room. Halvard at the table. June standing near the range with a mug. Tarm on the bench by the door. pulling off his outer boots. Me by the radio shelf. Standard positions. Everything the same as the 10 nights before it. Halvard said, "Count." Each of us said our names. Halvard said his. June said hers. Tarm said his. I said mine. Then Halvard counted. And the count was 4, and he wrote 4, and there was no mathematical problem. Everything was correct. But I had counted too. I couldn't help it. 14 years of ranger protocol meant I ran a parallel count the way you parallel park automatically, without consciously deciding to. And in the second, I looked around the room to confirm 4 against 4. Something had happened with the faces. Not dramatically, not cinematically. Just for the space of a breath, the room hadn't resolved correctly. Like looking at one of those images where the foreground and background keep swapping dominance. 4 people, but the 4 had taken a moment to settle into 4 in a way that made me recount. Halvard counted 4. I counted 4. 4. But I had done it 3 times. Halvard had been watching me. When I finally committed to the number and he saw the moment I stopped internally recounting, something in him loosened. Not relief, exactly. More like confirmation. He capped the pen. June set her mug down. "Always write it fast," she said quietly, not looking at me. "Don't let yourself second-guess the number." "I wasn't second-guessing," I said. You counted again after the first count." I didn't say anything. "Don't," she said. "Count once. Write it. Let it go. The rule isn't about accuracy. Counting again is how you get confused." I thought about Rule 1. The written number is the truth, not the seen number, not the confirmed 3 times number. The written number. As if the act of writing it once and committing to it was the mechanism that made it true, as if holding the count open, reviewing it, going back to it, was itself the problem. I had spent 2 years trying to learn to trust my counts, and here was June telling me that trust was less important than velocity. Count once, write it, release it. I lay in my bunk that night and turned that over for a long time. The obvious professional reading was that this was about preventing analysis paralysis in a high-stress environment, that double counting introduced hesitation, and hesitation in a small, isolated crew in lethal cold had operational costs. That made sense. That was the rational explanation, and I held on to it. But there was a secondary reading that I couldn't fully dismiss, one that the margin note kept pushing back into view. The count is a door. Don't hold it open. What if holding the count open, recounting, re-examining, staying inside the process of counting rather than completing it and moving on, was itself a form of holding a door open? What if the act of reviewing the count, of keeping the question of how many alive in the room, was the vulnerability? I wrote that in my notebook. I underlined it. Then I listened to the generator cough at 3 a.m. 2 beats, caught, lights held, and I did not sleep for another hour after that. And the silence outside the lodge walls was the same heavy, attentive silence it had been on the first night. And I was aware, in some back part of my brain, that I could not quiet, that I was counting the darkness again. 1 by the window, 2 at the table, 3 in the bunks. I was supposed to be 4. It happened on the 14th night, a Thursday by the calendar, though the days had started to bleed at the edges, the way they do when the dark is 20 hours long and the light is more of a rumor than a fact. We'd had 2 days of high overcast, and the temperature had dropped to -22. And the kind of cold that reaches that depth starts to simplify your thinking. You become very focused on what's warm, what's working, and what's between you and the outside air. The 9 p.m. count. Standard positions, standard procedure. I counted 4 before anyone said a name. Habit. The parallel count I ran without deciding to, the one June had told me not to run. I caught myself and waited for the formal count, ready to write down 4 and let it go and not go back to it. Halvard said, "Count." Halvard said his name. June said hers. Tarm said his. I said mine. I wrote 4. Then I looked up from the logbook, and I counted 5. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the description matters. It wasn't that there was a clear extra person standing in the room with a face I didn't recognize. It wasn't a stranger in the corner. It was more like the room was slightly too full in a way that didn't resolve into a face when I looked for it. Like trying to count a reflection that keeps shifting. The space between the table and the far wall had a density to it that 4 people didn't account for. And when I tried to locate it specifically, to pin it down with my eyes, it moved to the edge of my vision and stayed there. 4 names, 4 voices. The logbook said 4. My hand had written 4. 5. My hands went cold before the rest of me did that specific peripheral coldness that's not about temperature. That's the body's circulatory system, making a quiet emergency decision about which parts of you it can afford to keep warm right now. I'd felt it on Prager Ridge. I hadn't felt it since. I looked at the logbook. 4. My own handwriting. The number I had written 30 seconds ago. The written number is the truth. Rule 1. I looked at the room. 5. The thing about wrong numbers, the thing I understood from 14 years of field work and 2 years of dispatch and one specific Montana night I would give anything to take back, is that a wrong number is not an abstraction. A wrong number is a gap. A wrong number is a space where something is present that the count doesn't account for, or absent that the count insists is there. A wrong number is a failure of the instrument, and in my experience, the instrument is always the human. Except the logbook said 4, and I had 4 voices and 4 names and 4 people I could individually account for by every normal standard of verification, and the room had 5. I sat very still. Halvard was watching me. He had not looked at the room since I'd started staring at the space by the far wall. He was watching me the way you watch someone take a step onto ice you're not certain will hold attentive, still, ready, not intervening yet. "Dale," he said, quiet, level. "There are 5, I said. The words came out smaller than I intended. He didn't look at the far wall. He looked at the logbook in front of me. What does the log say? 4. My voice was steady. My hands were not. Then what do we do? I looked at the binder on the shelf. Rule 3. The rule I'd called superstition 12 days ago. If the nightly count is 1 too many, do not search for the extra. The thing I'd told myself was frontier theater. There was something by the far wall that had no name in our logbook. And Rule 3 was the only thing in the binder that addressed it. Halvard was already moving. He didn't move fast, Nothing about Halvard was fast. But there was a precision to it that made fast seem irrelevant. He crossed to the light switch at the same pace he crossed a room for anything. Controlled, deliberate, the pace of someone executing a procedure they have drilled. "Close your eyes," he said to the room. "Then open them for the dark." "What are we—" Tarm started. "Rule 3, June said. She was already setting her mug down, already positioning herself. She sounded like a person who had done this before, or who had been told exactly what it felt like and believed the telling completely. The lights went out. Interior Alaska, in a blacked-out lodge at 9 p.m. in late October, is not like normal darkness. There is no ambient glow, no streetlight bleed through the curtains, no moon through the windows. The dark was total and immediate, a weight that landed on us the second the overhead lights died. I could hear the propane burner's pilot light, a barely there blue hiss, and the generator's distant hum in the utility room, and my own breathing, and the breathing of the 3 people I had named, and something else. Not breathing, not exactly. The quality of the air on the far side of the room had changed, the way it changes when a space that was occupied becomes unoccupied, a subtle drop in warmth, a tiny atmospheric shift. I could not have measured it. I could only notice it the way you notice the moment a conversation ends. "Names," Halvard said, into the dark. "Real names," said Once, with certainty. "I'll start." He said his name, flat and definite, the way you say something that is simply, factually true. "June." She said it the same way. Not a question, not a request, a statement. Tarm. The kid's voice was steady, which surprised me, and then I understood he'd probably been briefed more thoroughly than I had, and had made his own peace with this. I opened my mouth. Thought of Gerald Fitch. Thought of the number 3 I'd said into a Montana whiteout with absolute confidence while 4 people stood in the dark around me. Thought of Rule 6, about hearing your own name answered when you didn't speak it. "Dale?" I said. The pause that followed was the longest 4 seconds of my life. From the far side of the room, from the space near the far wall where the density had been, something almost formed. Not a voice, not even a sound, more like the shape that a sound would make if it couldn't quite become one. A pressure at the edge of hearing. Then the generator coughed. 2 beat. Pause. Caught. The lights came back up. I was standing in a room with 4 people. Halvard, June, Tarm, and the man my hands confirmed was shaken against the radio shelf. The far wall was just a wall. Halvard walked to the logbook, picked up the pen, and wrote in the notes column, "Reset, 0302. I stared at the 2-word note. The logbook recorded it the same way it recorded fuel levels and weather readings, without commentary, without emphasis, without any acknowledgement that something had just happened in the dark that did not have a category in any field manual I'd ever read. Tarm sat down on the bench and released a very long, very controlled breath. June picked up her mug. "What?" I started. My voice came back wrong. I cleared my throat and tried again. What was it? What was the 5th? "We don't talk about what it is," Halvard said. "We talk about what the rules say to do about it." He recapped the pen. "You did well." You didn't search for it. You didn't hold the count open. I almost said that I needed to understand what it was, that I was a professional, and that professionals needed information to operate effectively, and that you couldn't ask someone to run an emergency protocol without explaining the emergency. Instead, I stood against the radio shelf, with my hands no longer shaking quite as badly as they'd been, and I looked at the 2-word notation in the logbook, and I thought about Rule 3's wording. Do not search for the extra. Do not be afraid of the extra. Do not look at the extra. Do not search for it. As if searching was the specific mistake, as if trying to find it, to locate it, to resolve the anomaly in the count, as if that was the behavior that cost you. I thought about the margin note on the back of the protocol page. The count is a door. Don't hold it open. The darkness had been the door. The names had been the lock. And I had, almost in that 4-second pause before my own name, almost not spoken at all. The propane burner ticked in the corner. Outside, the dark sat on the lodge without moving. I needed to know what we were dealing with. I needed to understand the mechanism, the history, the shape of it. And I needed to understand why Halvard, who clearly had answers, was choosing so carefully which ones to give me, and when. 3 days after the first reset, the temperature dropped to -31, and we had a clear sky and 20 hours of clean dark and the kind of stillness that makes the station feel like the last warm object in the world. We'd settled into a new version of the routine, the same procedures, but with a different weight to them, like furniture you rearrange after a flood. Everything in its same place, but you know what the room looked like with water in it. Tarm drew the afternoon rope line inspection. The buddy rope, a static line strung between the lodge and the equipment shed, needed a daily check for ice accumulation and anchor integrity, because in a serious whiteout, it was the only way to navigate the 60-foot gap between the two buildings. It was a 20-minute job in good conditions and a 40-minute job in anything else. The sky was clear. He said he'd be back well before 9. He wasn't back at 8:45. Halvard and I watched the clock. June had the generator manual out and wasn't watching the clock, but she was listening to the room in the way she listened to machinery, for the quality of things being one increment off from where they should be. At 8:52, Halvard put on his outer layer and went to the door. He didn't open it. He looked at the time. At 8:57, we heard the knock. 3 knocks, solid, on the lodge door. And then Tarm's voice. Hey, it's me. The near anchor had some ice. Took longer than let me in. It's -30 out here. The voice was correct. The cadence was correct. The specific phrasing, let me in, was the kind of slightly impatient request a 20-something who was cold and slightly embarrassed about being late would make. Rule 2. No entry after 9 p.m. If someone is outside at 9 p.m., they overnight in the shed. You've got 2 minutes, Halvard said through the door. Loud enough to be heard, calm enough to sound like he wasn't calculating anything. Get to the shed. There's a burner, food, a bag rated to -30. Radio us when you're in. Halvard, come on, I'm right here. Get to the shed. A silence. Then, it's not 9 yet. It will be before you're inside, and the door is closed, and I'm certain of the count. Another pause. When the voice came back, it was the same voice, the same tarm, the same cadence, but there was a quality to it that I registered and couldn't immediately name. Not desperation, not anger. Something that was performing desperation and anger, and not quite landing it correctly, like someone who'd learned the words to an emotion, but not the music. "Dale," the voice said, "tell him. Tell him to let me in. You can see it's me." My hand was already at the door handle. I had not decided to put it there. It was just there. The way your hands sometimes know the right thing before your brain has finished the meeting. I grew up in a world where you help the person at the door, where you do not leave someone outside in -31, where the cost of being wrong by being too kind is 0, and the cost of being wrong by being too hard is a man-shaped hole in a snowdrift. Halvard's hand came down on top of mine, not grabbing, just weight. The full, patient weight of a man who has already had this conversation with himself and settled it. "Where is Tarm right now?" he said. Not to the door. To me? I didn't understand the question. "Where is Tarm right now?" he said again. "If Rule 2 is real, if it works the way it says it works, where is Tarm?" The thing on the other side of the door knocked again. The knock was slightly too hard, slightly too much force, like someone who'd been told what a knock sounds like, but had miscalibrated the weight behind it. I took my hand off the handle. 8:59 became 9 o'clock on the clock above the radio. The lodge was locked for the night. For 11 minutes, the voice outside the door continued. I tracked it by the clock because I needed to put the time somewhere external, somewhere outside my own head. Because inside my own head, the calculation kept running the same way it had always run. There is a person outside in -31-degree air, and you are the warm person with the door handle, and every second of delay has a cost. That calculus was 14 years of professional conditioning. It didn't turn off because a laminated protocol page told it to. The voice started with appeals. Reasonable, specific, slightly aggrieved the precise emotional register of a young man who'd gotten stuck outside at the wrong minute and was now dealing with a rule that felt punitive and excessive. It said it was cold. It said the anchor had genuinely been iced over, and the job had taken longer than expected. And wasn't that exactly the kind of situation that should come with some flexibility? Then it started with names. Halvard. Come on. It's 15 below in that shed, and the burner takes 5 minutes to warm up. June. June, you know me. Tell him to open it. Rule 5 moved through my mind. Anyone who volunteers another person's name is not counted as present. The voice knew our names. All of them. It said them correctly, with the right shapes, June's name with the flat Midwestern vowel she actually used, Halvard's with the slight Nordic weight on the first syllable, mine with the particular neutral flatness of someone who's heard it said 100 times in a working context. Dale. Dale, you're new? You don't know how this goes. This isn't right. He shouldn't be able to leave me out here because of a 2-minute window. Talk to him. I stood against the far wall and did not talk to him. Because Tarm was asleep upstairs. We knew this because June had gone to check, quietly, while Halvard and I maintained positions, near the door. And she'd come back and held up 4 fingers, 4 in the building, and pointed upward. And then Halvard had looked at me with the specific expression of a man presenting evidence he wishes he didn't have. Tarm had come in from the rope line inspection at 8:38. He was in his bunk by 8:45, which we'd all registered without noting consciously the way you register unremarkable things. He was upstairs, warm, asleep, with no knowledge that his voice was at the door. What was at the door was something that had learned Tarm's voice well enough to use it, and our names well enough to deploy them as leverage. It knew that Dale is new, and might be persuadable. It knew that June is warm-natured, and might be movable. It knew that Halvard is the doorkeeper, and had assigned him, correctly, as the primary obstacle. It could not, apparently, say its own name. It never once claimed an identity. It never said, "I'm Tarm, let me in." It said Tarm's name to us, about Tarm, as a reference, as a tool. It spoke for us, about us, around us. It did not say what it was. After 11 minutes, the voice stopped. The silence that replaced it was different from the silence before lighter, if that makes sense. The way a room feels different after a tension leaves it that you hadn't fully consciously registered as tension until it was gone. I didn't move for a moment. Then I went to the window and looked out at the rope line. Nothing at the door. The tracks in the snow led from the lodge toward the shed, and then stopped. Not at the shed. Not anywhere specific. They simply ended in the middle of the snow between the 2 buildings, as if whatever had been walking had decided to stop being present in a way that left tracks. I stared at the point where the tracks ended until the cold fogged the window glass. Then I turned back to the room, to Halvard and June and the logbook and the 4 count written there in ink. "In the morning," I said, "you're going to tell me what we're actually dealing with." Halvard looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." He said it in a tone that made clear the morning felt very far away. He told me in the morning, over the first coffee, while the station radio ran at 6 a.m. diagnostic static, and the temperature outside was still -28, and the sky was the specific steel gray of interior Alaska at first light. He told me plainly and without theater, the way you brief someone on a hazard, not because you want to frighten them, but because the information is necessary for the work. You can't see it for what it is. That was the first thing. Not, "It's hard to see," or "It's disguised." You literally cannot look at it and understand what it is from visual evidence. The eye processes it as human. The face, the posture, the movements, everything your visual system uses to categorize a person, it satisfies all of it. Whatever mechanism it uses to do that, none of us had the biology to work around. But you can count it. The count is the one instrument it cannot fully defeat. It can add itself to a room and be processed by every eye in the room as a person. But it cannot make the arithmetic work. If you have 4 crew and it's present, the room contains 5. Not metaphorically, not in some spiritual sense, literally, mathematically, 1 too many. Something about its presence registers on that level, even when it doesn't register on any other. "How?" I asked. Halvard turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Don't know," he said. Don't need to. I know what the rule does about it. That's enough. What it could also do, he said, was copy. Take the configuration of some one specific voice, appearance, manner, and produce a version that functioned alongside the original, not instead of, alongside, so that you might have two Junes or two Halvards, both of them passing visual inspection, both generating perfectly valid faces when you looked at them. The count would still read wrong 5 instead of 4, or 6 instead of 4. But the wrong number would be harder to assign because no individual figure looked wrong. The rules aren't superstition, he said. They're a detection system, the only detection system we have. He looked at me over his coffee. You don't fight it. You can't track it. You can't trap it. You can't run from it because there's nowhere to run to. You keep the number honest every single night for the entire duration of your posting. That's the job. That was the job before the headcounts and the fuel logs and everything else. The job is the count. I thought about the listing I'd found on the federal caretaker board, minimal duties beyond logging headcounts. I thought about how I'd read that phrase as a relief. What happens if you stop keeping it honest? I asked. Then it stays, he said. It gets a number in the log. It becomes part of the official count. And then you can't find it by arithmetic anymore because the arithmetic has accepted it. He paused. And then you're short one crew member you can't account for, and one thing you can't identify that's been inside the count long enough to look like whoever it took the space from. I sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce line with a sound like distant static. The shed, I said. Last night, the tracks stopped. They do that. What does that mean? It means it didn't need to go anywhere. It was trying for the door. When the door didn't open, it stopped needing to be in a specific place. He set down his coffee. The rules work, Dale. They've worked for 40 years. We just have to keep following them. Every single night, I said. Every single night, he said. Forever. Forever was a word, he said, the way experienced people say words that contain costs they've already paid. I asked about Rule 6 before he could close the conversation. He went still, a different quality of stillness from his usual deliberate calm. This had an edge to it, something that he was managing carefully, the way you manage a topic that isn't about professional information, but about something that happened to someone and left a residue. The last caretaker, I said. You said he called the reset superstition. You said there's an opening because of him. That means he didn't leave, not normally. And the margin note is his. I waited. He started hearing his own name answered, Halvard said, late in the posting, month 4. The counts had been clean for weeks long, clean stretch, which sometimes happens, which sometimes makes people careless. He got careless. He paused. He did Rule 3. Count came out right. He thought it was over. Then he heard his name again. And he did Rule 3 a second time. Never twice in one night. Never twice in one night. What happened? Halvard was quiet for a moment. Then, the log, after that night, has 2 entries in his handwriting. Same shift, same night. The second one says there are 2 of him, and only one gets warm. He looked out the window. Then the next entry is different handwriting, Mine. The specificity of that same shift, same night, 2 entries, different handwriting settled into me slowly and completely. Not 1 entry, and then silence. 2 entries. The second one written by the original, and the third one written by whoever arrived to find the result. The last caretaker had experienced the thing that Rule 6 existed to describe. He'd heard his own name answered. He'd done the reset. And then something had been wrong enough that he'd done it again. And doing it again had split the outcome in a direction that ended with 2 versions of the same man, and only 1 warm space and a margin note written in a hand that was no longer writing anything afterward. The margin note, I said. He wrote it after. Before the second reset, Halvard said, while he still could. I didn't ask anything else about Rule 6 that morning. The information I had was sufficient, not sufficient to reassure me, but sufficient to function on, which was the only kind of sufficient available at Telek Fork. You said I could look at the old logbooks in the shed, I said. He looked at me. If I wanted to understand, I said, you said they were there. He was quiet for a moment. They're there, he said, back shelf, rubber banded by year. You can look. He stood, picked up his coffee. Be back before 9. He said it without emphasis. The way you say something, you're certain the person is going to need reminded of later. And you want to establish it early, so when the time comes, you can point to having said it. He was right to say it. I went to the shed at 2 p.m. while the light was still functional, which in late October at that latitude meant gray and thin and working on borrowed time, but present. The equipment shed was, as Halvard had described, survivable in an emergency, minus the word comfortable, which it had no ambitions toward. Metal shelving units, tool racks, snow machine parts in labeled bins, survival gear sealed in orange dry bags. The propane burner in the corner. A sleeping bag in a protective case on the top shelf. Everything arranged with the pragmatic efficiency of people who had thought carefully about what you need to not die here and had made exactly that available and nothing extra. The logbooks were on the back shelf, rubber banded by year, as he'd said, going back to a date 42 years before my arrival. 9 binders total, some thicker than others, the older ones with covers softened by handling, and the edges of the pages darkened with cold storage. I took the oldest one first, carried it to the workbench, and opened it in the gray shed light. Columns, date, names, count, notes. Exactly the same format as the current logbook. Whoever had designed the system had designed it to be consistent across decades, which was either bureaucratic thoroughness or a recognition that the information needed to be readable by whoever came next, regardless of when that was. The first years were clean. Nightly, 4-count, occasional 3-count when the crew was short-staffed, the notes column carrying only weather events and maintenance flags. Fuel, generator, snow load, clean counts for months at a stretch. Then, reset, 147. Clean note, matter of fact. 2 weeks later, reset, 303. Then 3 months of clean counts again. I flipped forward in years. The pattern held across all the decades mostly clean. A reset every few months or less. The resets noted without commentary, the way you note a pressure reading that required adjustment. This was expected. This was managed. This was the station, doing what the station did, correcting the count, continuing. But there were red entries, not frequent, maybe one per logbook, sometimes two, written in red pen, clearly a separate notation system, obviously significant. Miscount door held. After every red entry, a crew name appeared in the log for some number of days, and then simply stopped. Not a note about departure or transfer, not a closing entry. The name filled its column, and then was absent. And the count for the next entry was one lower, and the notes column for that final entry was blank. I went through all 9 binders, 14 red entries in 42 years. 14 times the door had been held open, the count had been corrupted, and someone had stopped appearing in the log. The names before each gap were different people, different decades, different crew compositions. Some had been at the station for months before it happened. 2 had been there for less than 3 weeks. The station's history was a body count. Not a dramatic one, not a row of dates and causes, just a slow arithmetic of absences accumulated over decades, the ledger recording each gap with the same flat notational language it used for generator maintenance and snowfall totals. I thought about what Halvard had said. It becomes part of the official count. It gets a number in the log. What had the red entry crew members seen in the moment before they opened the door? A face they recognized, probably. A voice they knew. Someone cold and hurt and needing to be let in. And they had calculated the same way my hand had gone to the door handle the night before, that the cost of being wrong by being too kind was 0. That opening the door for someone real and warm was the obvious right thing to do. The logbook said otherwise. The logbook had been saying otherwise for 42 years, in the dry language of missing names and lower numbers and notes columns left deliberately, pointedly blank. I set the last binder back in its rubber band and looked at the most recent one I hadn't yet read, the previous caretaker's binder. His name was Renner Solis, and the first months of his entries were clean and professional, clear handwriting, consistent format, a voice in the notational style that read as methodical and detail-oriented. He logged weather with specificity and generator readings to 2 decimal places, and his reset notes included timestamps to the minute. He was the kind of person who kept good records because good records were, to him, intrinsically satisfying. I recognized the type because I'd been trying to become that type for 2 years. The entries held clean through month 3. In month 4, the writing changed. Not dramatically at first. A slightly harder pen pressure, a note in the margin of a routine count, something off, corrected standard reset. Then a note that read, second look at the count window. All fine. Then, I keep retallying after the official count. June says stop. She's right. Stopping. I knew exactly what he was describing. I'd done it on day 11. The parallel count. The inability to write the number and release it. He wrote, I'm hearing something at the count that I can't identify. Not an extra body, not a wrong number, just a quality, like an echo. Then, 2 weeks later, heard my name answered tonight. I didn't speak first. I don't know who spoke it. Did the reset. Count cleared to 4. Normal. He had done the right thing. He'd followed Rule 6, done Rule 3, gotten a correct count. It should have ended there. The protocol was working. Then, 4 days later, count went wrong again. 5. did the reset, cleared. But in the dark, before the generator cycled, I heard my name twice. My own voice, both times. I don't know which one was mine. He had been at the station for 4 months by then. 4 months of correct counts and correct resets, and exactly the right procedural responses to everything the station required. And something had found the crack, the exact crack I had, the specific vulnerability of a man who doubted his own counts, who second-guessed his own numbers, who held the count open rather than writing it and releasing it. The count is a door. Don't hold it open. He'd been holding it open for weeks without knowing it. The final entry in his handwriting was dated at 3:09 a.m. There are 2 of me now. Only one gets warm. I wrote this so whoever reads it understands. Don't count yourself twice. Don't stay inside the question of how many. Write it and let it go. Write it and let it go. The count is a door. Then the margin note. The same words I'd read on the laminated page, pressed hard, the letters slightly uneven. The count is a door. Don't hold it open. The next entry was in Halvard's handwriting. 3 souls. Soulless. Absent. Recovery requested. Station holding. I sat in the shed for a long time after that. 3 souls. Not 4. Not a note about a transfer or a flight out. 3. The station had gone from 4 to 3, the way it had gone from 4 to 314 times before. And the note was the same flat, procedural language. And the implication was the same flat, procedural silence. The light through the shed window had gone from gray to dark while I was reading. I looked at my watch. 8:44 p.m. The rope line was 60 feet of darkness between me and the lodge. I put the binder back on the shelf, pulled on my outer layer, and moved. I made it back at 8:57. Halvard was at the door when I came through it. He looked at my face, and at the clock, and back at my face, and the fraction of relaxation he expressed was enough to tell me he'd been monitoring my return with more concern than he'd shown. I told him what I'd read. He listened without interrupting, which was its own form of confirmation. He didn't deny any of it, didn't re-explain any of it, didn't offer any reassurance that didn't exist. He just listened, and when I finished, he said, "Now you know what the rules are for." "Now I know," I said. That night's count was clean. 4. Written fast. Released. The storm arrived 36 hours later. It came in off the north in the specific silent way that interior Alaska storms arrive not with wind buildup or a visible front, but as a sudden compression of the air, and then white. Not snow, exactly. More like the air became opaque. The temperature dropped 4 degrees in 40 minutes, and the visibility outside the windows went from poor to non-existent while we were eating dinner. And by the time we'd cleared the plates, the wind had its voice back, and the voice was substantial. We ran the storm protocol, fuel reserves confirmed, roof load assessed, the buddy rope checked and re-anchored. All 4 of us inside well before the 9 p.m. window. Everything that could be secured was secured. The station had weathered 70 years of interior Alaska winter, and it did what it was built to do, which was hold. The count was clean. 4. At 6 a.m., I keyed the HF radio for the All Souls check-in. Static. I adjusted the frequency and tried again. Static with a slightly different texture. I ran the antenna diagnostic, which came back nominal, and tried a 3rd time on the backup frequency. Nothing. radio silence, not the active interference of a jammed signal, just the flat absence of a receiving station on the other end. The storm could do this. HF radio in interior Alaska during a significant weather event was not a guaranteed instrument. Dead zones were documented. Signal loss was operationally normal. Rule 4. If dispatch does not answer, assume the count is already wrong. I did not assume the count was wrong based on one missed check-in during a documented storm event. That would have been overcorrection, and I wrote it in my notes as such. Missed 0600 check-in, storm attributed, count verified internally at 4, will retry at next window. But I wrote it down. I logged the rule. I logged the assumption the rule required. The storm held for 2 days. We missed the 6 a.m. check-in again on the second morning. And on the third morning, when the sky cleared and the HF frequencies reopened, and I keyed the radio with genuine relief, dispatch answered but took 4 seconds longer than usual to acknowledge, and the confirmation came back slightly differently structured than normal. Not wrong, not impossible, just slightly off format. The number confirmed was 4. I wrote it down. I logged the format difference. I did not say anything to the crew yet, but I thought about what Halvard had said. It learns to spoof the one outside check. I thought about an entity that had been operating around this station for 42 years and had presumably learned, incrementally, everything about how the protocols worked, including, eventually, the radio. The tools that kept us honest were going dark. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a missed check-in here, a slightly wrong format there, the slow erosion of the redundancies we'd built into the system. And that night, at 9 p.m., I came to the count with the specific alertness of someone who has understood that the next wrong number will not be the first. Count. Halvard said it the same way he'd said it every night. Halvard said his name. June opened her mouth and stopped. A half-breath, a pause of 1 second where her name should have been. June. The name filled the pause. Correct voice, correct flat, Midwestern vowel. From somewhere beside and slightly behind where June was standing. June's mouth had not moved. I watched June's face in the second after it happened, and what I saw was not surprise. It was the particular controlled stillness of someone who has just heard something wrong and is very carefully not reacting until they've confirmed what they heard, because reacting incorrectly to the thing you thought you heard has costs. Then Tarm said his name. I said mine. The count, by voices, came out 4. 4 names in the air. Rule 5. Anyone who volunteers another person's name is not counted as present. If the voice that said June was not June, then we'd had 4 names spoken, but one of them was an impersonation. And the count was wrong in a way that was new. Not a visible extra, not an arithmetic bump to 5, a substitution, a correct number, but with one slot occupied by something that could not legitimately claim its place. I looked at Halvard. He was looking at June. Say your name, he said. She said it. Her voice, from her mouth, the same name. The count now had 2 Junas in it. One from a voice with no mouth, and one from June. Halvard's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. Not panic, Halvard didn't do panic. But the composure that had been so total and reliable for the weeks I'd known him developed, in that moment, a visible weight, as if the muscle holding it in place had been asked to work harder than it was designed for. He did not say anything for 4 seconds. Then, "We may have a copy," he said. "Not an extra. A copy." I thought about the logbooks, about what copies meant, about the distinction between one too many and the same number but wrong. The first was detectable by arithmetic. The second was detectable only by Rule 5, the rule that disqualified anyone who spoke for another, because the entity's mechanism was to speak from outside the identity it occupied. It could put a voice in the room. It could not, apparently, put a legitimate identity behind the voice. It couldn't say what it was. It could only be what it wasn't. Halvard looked at June, the June we'd watched, the June whose mouth had stayed closed. "Are you June?" he said. Flat, quiet, the tone of a man running the only diagnostic available. "Yes," she said. "Then the other one isn't," he said. I looked at where the voice had come from, beside and behind June, slightly left of the counter. Nobody there. Nothing visible. The room had 4 people in it, and 3 of them were named, and one was a name in the air, with no face. "We do the reset," I said. Halvard nodded. His face was still carrying that new weight as he reached for the light switch. For the first time since I'd arrived at Tellick Fork, Halvard Nass looked uncertain. That scared me more than anything the Count had done yet. We did not do the reset that night. We tried. Halvard's hand went to the light switch, and the lights went out, and we said our names into the dark: Halvard, June, Tarm, Dale. 4 clear voices, 4 claimed identities. And then we waited for the generator's cycle. The generator didn't cycle. 3 a.m. came, and the cough didn't come with it. And in the dark and silence, I became aware that the thing that had been holding the whole system together, the mechanical heartbeat of the station, the 2-beat and catch that Tarm had described as something you get used to, had developed the 3-beat pause that June had categorized as her problem. In the dark, we heard it labor. 3 beats, a long pause, a cough that didn't catch. Then it caught. But the lights didn't come back. Power failure. Generator had cycled, but the load transfer hadn't completed a fault in the relay, the specific relay June had been trimming back toward spec for weeks. In the dark, I heard her moving immediately, headed for the utility room from memory. And I did not move because moving in total darkness in a room where the count might already be wrong seemed like exactly the wrong kind of initiative. The emergency lights came on at 3:04. Battery backup, amber, insufficient for detail, but enough to see shapes. Halvard counted immediately. He counted 4. He counted again. 6. The emergency light amber was enough to show me what 6 meant. In the specific way that this thing worked, the way it added itself to a room that your eyes processed as simply full. There were 2 shapes near the table that read as Halvard to my eyes, and I couldn't isolate which was which, both of them solid and still, and carrying themselves with Halvard's particular deliberate posture. And there was a second June, slightly closer to the generator room door, not quite positioned the way the real June had been positioned when the lights went out. Tarm was beside me. 1 person, 1 version. And I could feel the quality of his stillness, the very controlled kind that comes from someone trying very hard not to do anything wrong when they don't know what wrong looks like. Dale, one of the Halvards, spoke. Calm, practical. Almost exactly the right voice. You should run the reset. You know the names. June needs to stay on the generator. The other Halvard said nothing. Rule 5. Anyone who volunteers another person's name is not counted as present. The Halvard who had spoken my name had just disqualified itself. But the count was still 6, and the reset required darkness we no longer had, and a generator cycle that had just failed, and a certainty about who was real that I needed to produce in a room with 6 shapes, 2 of which were Halvard, and 2 of which were June, and only one of each was the person I knew how to name. I'll run it, I said. I said it to the Halvard who hadn't spoken, and I watched in the amber emergency light to see if it looked at me with recognition, or with the slight, miscalibrated quality that the thing outside the door had shown when it laughed. Halvard, the real one, looked at me, and what I saw in his face was the same weight I'd seen when the copy June had spoken. The weight of someone who has been doing this job long enough to know when it has gotten worse than the rules were built for. He said, "Then do it." June got the generator relay replaced at 3:17 a.m. The lodge went fully dark between the emergency battery dying and the main power coming back. 4 seconds of total blackness. And in those 4 seconds, something in the room breathed with a quality that the 3 of us who were counting did not breathe with. Then, full lights. Count 6. Now, I said. I went to the main switch myself. The lights died. True dark came down. I stood in it with my back to the wall, which was the most defensible geometry I could manage, and I understood that I was about to do the thing that had undone the last caretaker. I was going to say names into the dark. I was going to name real people with certainty. And I was going to say my own name last, because the last caretaker had said his own name and heard it answered. And whatever that meant for me tonight was something I would find out at the end. Halvard. I said it as a statement of fact, the way you say the name of something you know, completely not a question, not a check, just a certainty placed into the room. Here, the right voice from the right part of the room with the right cadence. June? I said it the same way. Here, from the generator room door, June's voice. Tarm? A half-second pause that felt like falling, and then, here, the kid's voice from beside me, and I could feel the relief in it. The sound of someone who'd been very quietly terrified for the last 47 minutes and was now allowed to say a word. 3 names. 3 answered. I held the dark. There were still 6 things in the room with me. 4 of them had answered. The count still required 2 more reckonings before it could be 4. The thing, the copy of Halvard, the copy of June, was somewhere in the dark with me, silent, waiting. It could not answer to a name spoken from the outside because it had no inside to answer from. It wore the shape of the person. It could not wear the certainty. I breathed. I said my own name. I said it the way Renner Solis had not been able to say it in the end, not as a question, not as a check, not as a man asking himself if he still existed. I said it as the man who had written 3 in a Montana field log while 4 people stood in the dark. The man who had lived in the gap between his count and the truth for 2 years, and understood, finally, standing in the dark in interior Alaska with 6 things in a 4-person room, that the gap had always been the enemy's territory. Doubt was the door. His guilt, my guilt, was the handle. Dale. The room held for 1 second. Then 2 voices answered, one from my left, one from my own mouth. I didn't stop. I didn't freeze. I held the certainty the way you hold a rope in a whiteout, not because you're certain it will save you, but because letting go is the only thing you're certain will kill you. The generator coughed. 2 beats. Pause. The lights were going to come back, or they weren't. The count was going to correct, or it wasn't. Whatever the reset actually did the mechanism underneath the procedure, the thing the laminated page described in behavioral terms without explaining the physics, was going to work, or it was going to do what it had done to Renner Solis. I held my own name. The generator caught. In the half-second before the lights came back, I understood something that no rule in the binder explicitly stated, but that all 6 rules were gesturing toward from different angles. The thing couldn't hold an identity from the inside. That was the core of it. It could copy the shape, the voice, the posture, the behavioral patterns, all the external signals that human beings use to identify each other. It was good at this. It had been doing it, presumably, for as long as the logbooks had been recording its presence, and in 42 years it had gotten very good. But identity isn't a surface. Identity is the thing that knows it's itself, the internal certainty, the selfhood that says, "This is me," without referencing anything external. You can copy a face. You cannot copy the experience of being behind the face. The naming in the dark worked because it stripped away the visual layer entirely. In complete darkness, with no face to copy, the entity had only voice, and voice could be mimicked, but the intention behind it couldn't. When Halvard said, "here," the word carried 40 years of knowing what it was to be Halvard. When June said, "here," it carried whatever June carried. The entity could produce the sound, but not the weight of it. And when I said my own name, the name of the man who had left Gerald Fitch behind and come to Alaska to make small, correct counts in a small, correct room, and learn to believe himself again, I said it with something I hadn't been able to locate for 2 years. Not confidence exactly, not certainty in the abstract, more like acceptance, the acceptance that I was this person, this specific flawed counter with this specific wound, and that the wound was not the same as an absence. I was real. The wound was part of what made me real. The guilt, the doubt, the hypervigilance. It was the organism, not the damage. Doubt is the door. My guilt, my lifelong doubt of my own counts, had been the crack it climbed through. But the doubt had also made me careful in ways that mattered tonight. The person who didn't trust his own counts was also the person who had noticed the extra breath before the generator cycled, who had followed Rule 5 in the dark, even while being afraid, who had said his own name last, and meant it. The reset didn't banish the entity by force. It worked because the entity could not claim what it had never possessed. In the dark, stripped of visual mimicry, required to place a name on itself, a name spoken with certainty. From inside the identity it was wearing, it had nothing to speak with. You cannot say your own name if you have no self to say it from. That was the mechanism. The binder couldn't write it down in plain language because plain language was inadequate. The margin note was as close as anyone had gotten. The count is a door. The door worked both ways. The entity entered through the gaps in certainty. The naming closed the gaps. The darkness was necessary because light gave it its only real weapon, the face. In the half-second before the lights came back, standing in the dark, with my own name still in the air, I understood all of this completely. And I understood that the man who doubted his own counts had done the most important count of his life correctly. Then the lights came back. 4 people. I counted before anyone moved, before the relief or the noise or the physical reckoning with what had just happened. I counted from where I stood and got 4 and wrote it in the air before I wrote it on paper, and then I crossed to the logbook and wrote it in ink. 4. Halvard, June, Tarm, Dale. 4 names, 4 people, 1 count, 1 number, written once, released. Tarm sat down on the bench and put his face in his hands for a moment, not crying, just depositing the weight of the last 2 hours somewhere that wasn't his chest. June leaned against the counter and looked at the generator room door with the expression of a woman assessing a repair that held under the most extreme load she'd ever tested it against. Halvard stood in the center of the room for a moment, then walked to the logbook, looked at my entry, and added the timestamp. Reset. 3:21. I looked around the room and tried to name what I felt, and couldn't quite. Not triumph, not the clean resolution of a problem successfully solved. Something more complicated than that the specific emotional texture of having come through something at cost, where the cost isn't yet fully visible, but you know it's there. Where's the second Halvard? I said. Halvard shook his head. Gone. And the second June? Gone. I nodded. And the one that answered my name? He looked at me carefully. Gone. 4. I looked at the 4 of us, then at the table where the chairs were. 1, 2, 3, and the 4th, Tarm's usual seat, where his jacket was still draped over the back from dinner. I had been counting chairs without thinking about it. Then I noticed it. Tarm's bunk. I could see through the open door to the dormitory wing. A shape in it. Still. The shape of a person. Sleeping. My counting stopped working. I looked at Tarm on the bench. He had his face up now, looking at me, looking at the bunk room. I'm here, he said. Quiet. I'm here, Dale. Your bunk, I said. Everyone looked. The shape in the bunk was still. Completely still. In the way that sleeping people are not completely still. In the way that things are still when they are not doing anything. When they have no functions to perform. That's my extra layer, Tarm said. I bunched it up when I changed for dinner. I looked at the shape for a long time. A bunched up extra layer was exactly the shape and size of a person seen through a doorway in amber emergency light. There was no reason that wasn't exactly what it was. I looked at the logbook. 4. I looked at the room. 4 voices, 4 bodies, 4 names. Halvard was watching me with the patience of a man who understood what I was doing and why. Write it, he said. Write it and let it go. I looked at the 4 I'd already written. I let it go. But I couldn't remember in the dark, during the naming, when I had spoken Tarm's name, and the half-second pause had resolved into his voice, couldn't remember, with absolute certainty, whether what had answered was the voice I knew, or a version that was close enough that I'd accepted it in the dark because I needed it to be right. I had needed Tarm to be real. In the dark, needing something to be true is a different instrument than knowing it is. The generator held its rhythm. 2-beat cough. Caught. Lights steady. I stood at the logbook with the 4 written in front of me, and the shape in the bunk room visible through the doorway, and the half-second pause sitting in my memory, like a splinter I couldn't locate to remove. 4 was the number I had written. 4 was what the log said. 4 was the truth. I released it. I did not fully believe it. That was the night I learned the difference. Dawn came at approximately 10:15, which in late October in interior Alaska meant a gray, gradual brightening rather than any dramatic sunrise, the sky going from black to dark blue to a specific pewter that was the closest thing to light the season offered. I had been awake since the reset. I'd sat in the main room through the remaining dark hours with the logbook in front of me and the count written there and the shape in the bunk room visible through the doorway. And I had not gone to look at the shape more closely because some part of me understood that looking more closely was the same as holding the count open. And I was trying, with everything I had, to stop doing that. By 6 a.m., I'd confirmed the shape was an extra layer. I'd walked in there, picked it up, shaken it out, identified it as Tarm's wool underlayer, and not as any configuration of absence that required a name. The kids' actual boots were by the door. Both of them, present. Tarm himself was asleep in the armchair in the main room, having apparently been unwilling to use the bunk room after what had happened, which was a reasonable position I did not judge. Halvard was on his morning fuel check. June was in the generator room, doing a post-event diagnostic with the thoroughness of someone writing a report for themselves about what happened and what needs to never happen again. I made coffee. I watched the daylight come. Tarm's bunk stayed cold. He'd never slept in it after dinner. The log said 4. The room had 4. The count was clean, and I had written it, and it was the written truth, and the written truth was what I was supposed to trust. But I couldn't stop returning to the half-second pause. Tarm's name in the dark, then the weight, then his voice. In the warm daylight of a clear interior Alaska morning, with my coffee getting cold in my hands, I tried to reassemble the quality of that voice, whether it had had his specific particular weight, the anchorage-born flatness he put on his consonants, the slight upward intonation he used when he was performing steadiness. I thought I remembered it correctly. I thought the voice had been his. Thought. That was the word I kept coming back to. Thought and believed, and was almost certain, and every iteration was a fraction of a degree away from new. The man in the armchair had Tarm's face. His breathing had the irregular rhythm of actual sleep. His jacket was the right jacket, worn in the right places, with the ink stain on the left cuff from the week he'd been fixing the rope line anchors, with a marker in his pocket. These were all the things that had to be true. They were all the things the entity had been copying for 42 years. I drank my coffee. I looked at the log. I looked at the 4 I'd written. April was 5 months away. 5 months of 9 p.m. counts, of 4 names in the air, of the generator's 2-beat cough at 3 a.m. 5 months of trusting the logbook over my eyes, and my eyes over nothing, and the darkness and the names over everything else. I thought about Gerald Fitch, about the 200 yards, about the number 3 I had been so certain of that I had written it down and moved on without going back. The worst thing about that night wasn't that I got the number wrong. The worst thing was that I had been certain. Absolutely, professionally, competently certain. And he had still been out there. 4 was the number I had. 4 was what the log said. 4 was the only truth available. I picked up the pen and verified it, and then I let it go, the way you let go of something you're not completely sure is safe to release, which is the only way any of us ever lets go of anything. Dispatch would confirm the count this morning. Dispatch would read back 4, and the loop would close, and the day would continue. I waited for the radio window. The radio crackled at 6:08 a.m., 8 minutes past the usual window storm aftermath, frequencies still clearing, nothing unusual in the delay. I keyed the mic and gave my station ID and the count. Telic fork, 4 souls, all present. Static for 3 seconds. Then the confirmation. Copy, Telic fork, 5 souls recorded. Confirm. I kept my hand on the mic for a moment. The kind of moment where your brain runs 2 tracks simultaneously, the professional track that is already parsing the implications, and the human track that is very quietly saying no. Negative, dispatch. Count is 4. Repeat, 4. Telic fork, we have 5 in the roll. Last recorded crew update shows 5. Please recount and confirm. I set the mic down. I didn't key it off protocol. Requires an open line during a count discrepancy. I just set it down on the counter and turned and looked at the room. Tarm in the armchair, awake now, watching me. Halvard in the kitchen doorway, coffee in hand. June at the table, her generator log open, pen paused. 3 faces, 3 living people, and me at the radio, which made 4. 4. I counted 3 times, 4 each time. 4 faces, 4 bodies, 4 names I could assign with certainty to people I had watched, talked to, worked alongside for weeks. The count was clean. The count was clean, and it had been clean since the reset, and it was clean now. Dispatch said 5. Rule 4. If dispatch's number does not match yours, trust dispatch. I looked at the 3 faces watching me from across the room. I thought about Halvard, explaining the mechanism. It becomes part of the official count. It gets a number in the log, and then you can't find it by arithmetic anymore. I thought about the radio format that had been slightly off 2 mornings ago. I thought about 42 years of logbooks in the shed, and what the red entries said, and what came after them. I thought about dispatch's voice, and whether what was on the other end of the HF frequency this morning was the same thing that had been there last month, or whether the entity had found, finally, the one external check we'd been relying on to keep us honest, and had learned to sit inside it and read numbers back to us. 5, it said. 4, I counted. Rule 4 said, trust dispatch. Rule 4 was the rule that had always been the last line, the external authority that sat outside the station and could see what we couldn't. Rule 4 existed because we might be wrong about the people standing in front of us. We might be looking at a copy and not know it. Dispatch was supposed to be the instrument that had no face to copy. I looked at the 3 faces. I picked up the pen. I wrote 5 in the logbook. My hand did it before the rest of me decided to. The way my hand had gone to the door handle when Tarm's voice was outside, some automatic professional deference to the rule, to the external authority, to the protocol I had been hired to follow. 4, written in ink. Then a line through it. Then 5. Halvard was looking at the logbook from across the room. His face did the thing it had done in the dark when the copy June had spoken the weight behind the composure, the muscle working harder than it was designed for. I keyed the mic. Copy, dispatch, 5 confirmed. Acknowledged, have a good morning, Telek Fork. I set the mic down. I looked at the 5 in the logbook. I looked at the 3 people in the room with me. I did the arithmetic that Rule 4 required me to trust, which was this. If dispatch says 5 and I count 4, then one of the 4 I'm counting is something that registers as human to my eyes and as a number to their external record. And I cannot see the gap between what it is and what I think it is, because that is precisely what it is designed to prevent me from seeing. Or dispatch was wrong, or compromised, or the entity had found the radio and was using the one rule I was required to obey against me. I sat at the radio for a long time and counted the room, and did not write anything else, and did not key the mic, and did not speak. The logbook said 5. The room showed 4. Rule 1 said the written number is the truth. And I, the man who had broken over a wrong number, who had taken this job so that counting would be simple, who had stood in the dark 3 hours ago and said his own name with the first certainty he'd felt in 2 years. I looked at the 5 I'd written and understood that I no longer knew whether I was one of the 4 in the room or whether I was the reason the room came out wrong. Renner Solis had written, "There are 2 of me now. Only one gets warm." The generator had cycled. The lights had come back. I had been the one standing at the logbook. I could not, from the inside of my own experience, tell the difference between being the original and being the one that the darkness had chosen to keep. I counted the room again. 1, 2, 3, and then myself, 4. The 4th one, the counter, the one who writes the number. I picked up the pen. I wrote the number. I count people when I walk into a room, not on purpose, some part of my brain that I cannot shut off. I do it in grocery stores, in waiting rooms, in the break rooms of buildings I have never worked in. I do it because the number is the only thing that tells the truth when everything else has learned to lie. I do it because I no longer know if the number includes me, or if I am the reason the number is wrong. I wrote 5. I set the pen down. I let it go.